Welcome to IndoctriNation, a weekly conversation series about protecting yourself from systems of control. I'm your host, Rachel Bernstein.
Hello, everybody. Good to speak with you. I want to thank all of our listeners all over the world and, of course, to our regular listeners in the US and the UK and in Canada, and especially during the last week in Sweden and Ireland, New Zealand, Australia, as well as Estonia. Very interesting. Very, very interesting. Let me know if you're from any of these places, if you haven't already done so, about what speaks to you about this podcast in your part of the world. And so for today, we have Natalie Hoffman. Natalie Hoffman is the author of Is It Me? Making Sense of Your Confusing Marriage, a Christian women's guide to hidden emotional and spiritual abuse, and her recent memoir, All the Scary Little Gods. Natalie is also the host of the Flying Free podcast. She is a mother, grandmother, educator, and passionate advocate for women of faith in abusive homes and churches. Through the Flying Free Sisterhood program, Natalie empowers women to discover and use their God-given voices, gifts, and freedom to make choices for their own spiritual, emotional, and physical well-being. You can find more info on Natalie and her work at flyingfreenow.com. Here's Natalie now. It is so nice to be able to talk with Natalie Hoffman today. I've been excited about this interview because it's one of these times where we get to talk about things in a multi-layered way, which I really appreciate at times because you have different experiences that you're drawing on. And I think, of course, finding the overlap between them and one often leads into the next. Because people will sometimes think, what's wrong with me that I got involved in something else? Or, oh, this is what my lot in life is, that I'm always going to be involved in something that's going to be manipulative of me. But they're often a causal relationship, but also being able to apply a psychological kind of way of looking at this with systems and also internal family systems. I mean, that's just speaking to me as a therapist. But I can't wait to start our conversation. So if you don't mind taking a few minutes just to introduce yourself and then we'll get cooking.
My name is Natalie Hoffman. I am the author of 2 books. My first book was Is It Me? Making Sense of Your Confusing Marriage, a Christian woman's guide to hidden emotional and spiritual abuse. And then my new book that just came out in February of 2024 called All the Scary Little Gods, which is just a creative telling of my own story using internal family systems. My own story of coming up and out of tremendous spiritual and covert emotional abuse in my family of origin, my religious environment, and then a subsequent 25-year-long marriage. It's more than just my story. It charts one potential path for healing, I think, for Christian women who are survivors. I am a survivor. But I've also been an advocate for many years, and I work closely with women of faith through 2 programs, one Flying Free and Flying Higher, which is my program for divorced women. And then I have a public podcast, which is also called Flying Free.
I'm noticing a recurring theme. I mean, I think that's going to happen a lot as we're talking, but this idea of things being covert, of things being hidden. You know, part of the reason that it's so powerful to come forward, to write a book, to be on a podcast, to come forward with your story is so that things aren't hidden and things don't continue to exist in the shadows in the way that they should not and should never have. Because so many people who wrong other people can get away with it for so long because it's not brought to light. But even more insidiously, there's something that you're exposed to that doesn't come to light for yourself I think, for so long because it's covert. And I would love you to talk about that before we get into your story.
Your podcast is about how people can be indoctrinated, and it focuses on cults, but even in the Christian world or in religious communities where we wouldn't necessarily call them cults, there is a programming going on. And I think I would call it a more covert way of programming people because it's presented as biblical. It's presented as even couched in terms like love and peace and, helping people and doing those kinds of things. And yet, what's going on underneath it is a level of control, especially of certain people groups, such as women, for example. In certain religious communities, women are viewed as having certain roles, and men get the other roles, the more important, what they would call the more important roles. It's a way of powering over women. And then we are programmed to believe that that's a good thing. And it's a godly thing, and that we should aspire to that kind of subjugation and even rejoice in it. Anyway, my first book is mostly dealing with, what you just said, uncovering those covert ideas and that covert theology. I grew up in going to Bill Gothard. Are you familiar with the whole Bill Gothard thing?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And the listeners are too. We've had a lot of people talking. And what's interesting too is that even though, again, going back to this idea of overlapping, there are overlapping themes, but each person has had their own experience of it. And that's why I love hearing, I'll love to hear about your exposure there and how it impacted you. But go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the church I grew up in was your pretty run of the mill American church. It wasn't like super, super conservative, maybe more conservative than some other ones. But I think we were one of the only families that even went to the Bill Gothard thing. So it was more of a family thing that we did every year. And then we kind of brought that thinking into the way we viewed our faith and the way we lived it out. And I was the oldest child in my family, so I took everything very seriously. Like if you gave me a rule, I would follow it to the T. And Bill Gothard would even teach, you want to do more than follow the rule, because you want to do the rule, but then go over and above. Like that's what's the truly godly thing. That was kind of always in my head, and being a type A personality and just wanting to get straight A's and get all of the extra credit with God and everyone else. That really appealed to me because it was a way to do that. He had all the steps. So if you just followed the steps, it was so easy. It's those kinds of teachings, I think, that I really didn't figure out what the fruit of those was until I actually grew up and began to live that out in my adult life and saw the pathology that it brought into my own life, into my own parenting, into my own relationships, and just the shame and the fear that I lived with. Those two emotions were the predominant emotions that ruled my entire existence.
I wanted to say something about what you were talking about, going above and beyond. So I had something similar just with my personality, but I'm sure it also had to do with family system, where just my place in the family, the youngest, and needing to be the good kid when older siblings were really doing their thing, and my mom would often say, making her prematurely gray. So I had I had this sense of obligation, like, oh wait, my job is to make my parents' life easier, and that will be, that I need to follow the rules. And I think I did my first risky thing that wouldn't ever even be considered risky by any stretch of the imagination. But I think I was 16 or 17. And still, even if I told my mom now, she'd say, and like, it's still, I thought it was horribly risky, but whatever. There is this thing when you're doing, let's say, schoolwork, where you can get an A++++, if that's what you can get. And it's based on something that is tangible. But when you're talking about following rules or being a good person or being a good Christian, it feels so amorphous and invisible and right. And then how do you know you're there? And you have to kind of wait for like Bill Gothard or others to tell you. And so you're getting this like external validation, but you still, it's like endless. Like, going above and beyond is an endless thing. There isn't something about it where you've gotten there. So you just have to keep working and trying. It feels exhausting, actually.
If there's anyone in your life that has any kind of pathology that wants to actually use that to manipulate you, once they see that that's kind of one of your drivers, and they might not even see it consciously, but just unconsciously notice this about you. Once they see that, they're going to just go in for the kill. And they will know how to manipulate you to get you to dance, to do their thing, whatever it is that they want you to do in order to feel like you've accomplished what you need to accomplish and that you were a good Christian girl or wife or mother or whatever the case might be.
Right. And also when I was starting to become, a teacher, a special ed teacher, and then also a therapist, the clinic that I worked at taught me and taught all of us about this notion of the good enough parent. And it was in response to having, of course, usually the mother blamed for everything that went wrong with your kid, even psychiatric issues, but that women, especially, were running themselves ragged. And so there was a clinician who came up with this idea of the good enough parent. Like, when can you put your feet up and know that your kids are still going to be fine? Because it's very hard to gauge that. And it sounds like when you're saying that this applied to you as a parent, it's hard to know when you can rest and when you've done a good enough job.
Yes. Learning that towards the end, and towards the end of my book, All the Scary Little Gods, I talk about kind of the ways that I shifted my thinking in some areas. And that's definitely one of the mind shifts that I had to make. I was really good at taking care of everybody around me and wasn't really good at taking care of myself. I was good at listening to them and giving them credibility, valuing their thoughts and ideas and their needs. And I wasn't good at giving myself credibility or valuing my own thoughts. And even to this day, I still will sometimes have to stop and go, wait a minute, I'm really kind of throwing myself under the bus here. And my thought, yes, maybe they have a good point and a good perspective to consider, but I also have a perspective. I tend to be very in tune to other people's perspectives and want to hear them. And sometimes can even know where they're coming from before they even know where they're coming from. But I don't always give myself that same honor. And so I think just to learn how to honor my own self was an important thing to do. And that's not really taught in a lot of Christian cultures.
Right. Right. No, most definitely not. So, okay. So then to go back to having you kind of share things with us chronologically, because it doesn't have to be every single day, of course.
Yeah.
But just
Oh,
the
goodness.
highlights, right? On Tuesday, I did this. But just before lunch. But just sort of the highlights, but also because I love to see how one thing kind of affects the next. So go for it. Tell us what's good for us to know about your growing up years and leading into your adult life.
Yeah. Okay. The book is called All the Scary Little Gods. And I do tell the first part of it from the perspective of my younger self. The reader is getting that perspective of this little girl who doesn't really know what's happening to her, doesn't really know what's going on, and doesn't understand how she's being programmed. But the reader hopefully can pick up on, things. And I try to make it light and humorous in parts because I don't want it to get too heavy. But basically, I thought I grew up in the best Christian home you could possibly grow up in. I had a stay-at-home mother who made cookies, and when my little sisters and I came home from school, there were cookies and desserts, and she would listen to our stories. She was a great listener. She sang us lullabies before we went to bed. She read us books. She was a very involved mother. And I worshiped the ground that my mother walked on. But what I didn't realize is that my mother became a Christian when I was around 7 years old. And she bought into a way of thinking about Christianity that involved the rapture was going to happen at any minute. There were these dispensations. It was dispensationalism for anyone who knows what that is. And she truly believed that that was the only way to think about Christianity. And it was fine for me. She would read the Bible. She went to Bible studies that were all under this umbrella of thinking. And then she would come home and she would share with us what she was learning. And I just was like a sponge. I just ate it all up. How do you know? You swim in the pond you swim in, and that's familiar to you, and that's all you know. So I just bought into all of it. Throughout the book, I give little examples of experiences that I had. Like in the 70s, there was this I Found It campaign. Do you remember that at all?
Oh, yeah. Oh, I absolutely remember that. Yeah. And then there were responses to that. I remember bumper stickers. There was almost like a fight going on between different traditions and religions based on that. It triggered some things in other religions, which you probably were not necessarily exposed to if you just saw it from the, I Found It perspective. I know there were people, like there was a Muslim family we were friends with who had this bumper sticker that said, "Well, we never lost it," which is like, "Ooh, don't know if you had to go there," but like, just okay, right? But I get it. Like, okay, fine. Let's have this back and forth dialogue on bumper stickers. But go ahead. Yes, so I totally remember that. Mhm.
Yeah. So things like that. My mom was very much into evangelism. We would leave chick tracts all over the place. I had these Catholic relatives who I just loved. They had this big Catholic family, and I loved going over there, but they were all going to hell. I learned that they were going to hell because they were Catholics, and we used to pray every night for my grandparents. And I just had this deep fear of going to hell, and that you had to pray this prayer a certain way, and you had to truly believe it in your heart. And that if you didn't do that, then you were going to go to hell. So that's a very common theme I've heard. A lot of Christians growing up in that thinking, even my own children, of course, then I raised my children like that. And I remember them just asking me to pray again. Can you pray with me again so that I make sure that I go to heaven? And my fear as a mother, which was just like my mother's fear, that my children will go to hell. So we need to make sure that we're dotting our I's and crossing our T's. And yet at the same time, there's this teaching of grace, that God is a God of grace and God forgives. And once you're saved, you're always saved. And it was so weird. It was like all these contradictory things. Well, as I got older, I started pushing back a little bit, not to push back, but more because I was curious and I couldn't make sense of some things that I was learning. And plus I was getting out into I was going to high school and college and learning new ideas and other perspectives and thinking, that doesn't really match up with what I grew up with. So when I would ask questions about it, or I would push back a little bit on it with my mom, she would get very upset. My mom, she did not like, she was right. She was right all the time. And
okay. Yeah, I was going to ask what made her upset about that. Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, got it. You
Yeah.
were challenging her, and that's what made her frustrated. Okay.
Right.
Got it.
So, the other issue that was going on growing up that I didn't really realize was abusive until I got older and started learning more about abuse. And I thought, I think that was abusive. There was some physical things going on between my mom and I when she would get upset. And I wrote a very little taste of that in the book. And then she couldn't ever say she was sorry for anything. So when she did things to me, it was like it had to be swept under the rug, or she would turn it back on me and make it my fault and then give me the silent treatment until I had worked up this I had to show her and demonstrate that I was deeply sorry, that I understood how devastating that was for her, that I said this thing. I would do the Anne of Green Gables thing. I would just like drum it up, the emotion. I would sit in my room and get myself worked up to a state of like where I could like even be crying. And I genuinely felt it. It was not fake. I would go to my mom and I would be so sorry that I was that horrible and that destructive to her and beg for her forgiveness so that she wouldn't give me the silent treatment anymore. And Bill Gothard would teach that too. He would teach, it doesn't matter if they've offended you. There's always something that you've done wrong. So you need to go and make that right. And then what they did to you, you need to forgive them. And God's grace covers that. Well, that was drilled into me from the time I was a small child. So you can imagine then how that played out in my adult life, in my marriage, and in my relationships with other people. I could never be the one that was wronged. I was always the one that was doing the wronging. And so I had so much shame about who I was, couldn't figure out how to be a better person. And whenever anyone was unhappy with me or upset with me, which in life, this happens, people get upset with us. We can't be perfect. I didn't know what to do with that. And I would be so afraid that I'd lose those relationships because I had been really programmed with this idea that if you bring unhappiness to someone, you have violated, God's laws for you. And now you are a bad person and you need to repent and make it right with them in order to be in relationship with them. So I just carried that into my marriage then. I went to Northwestern College, which is a little college in Minnesota, Christian college. And I actually met some people there and I had a chance to break out. I tried to sort of show that in my book that there was an opportunity for me to change. I met some professors and some people who showed me a different way of living. One of my professors she was a professor and yet she was raising her family. Whereas I was taught to believe that, if you were a good Christian woman, you stayed home with your kids. You did not have a job. And I lived with her for a summer and I watched her kids while she worked on her PhD. I couldn't figure out how they could have such an amazing marriage and such a beautiful little family. And she was this fulfilled, happy professor who loved teaching English. And I wanted that so much. So I went into English. I got an English degree and they actually asked me to come back and go start getting my master's and asked me to teach at the college after that. And I said no because I had gotten married and I was pregnant and I knew that God would not want me to go and do that. He wanted me to be a mom at that point. So, and being a mom meant homeschooling and it meant staying home with your kids. So I slipped back into all of this thinking and my husband and I started to, and how we met and married, that's in the book too. That was also very interesting. And there was a whole courtship drama there. I married him because even though he had problems and issues that I wrote about in my journal, I thought that God was calling me to be his helper, to help him with his problems. And I did not know the depth of those problems until after we got married. And then, of course, you're not allowed to get divorced. So you've made your bed. So now you must lie in it. So I just went under. We started going to the Bill Gothard seminars again. We got involved in ATI, which is their homeschooling branch. I had 9 children. I had an incompetent cervix, so I'd have to have surgery before every single pregnancy. I was on bed rest for 4 of the pregnancies. It was just a whole thing. And sometimes I look back and I don't even know how I survived all of that.
Wow, my goodness. An incompetent cervix. What an interesting name for that.
Yeah.
But just knowing that you needed to have surgery on top of everything else and with 9 children and caring for them. And I don't know if you had any assistance, but that sounds...
No, I did not have any assistance, not even from my husband.
Wow.
So yeah, I was pretty much on my own. And then because we didn't have a lot of money and we had such a growing family, I ended up feeling like I needed to help out financially, but you couldn't work outside of the home. So I started my own business and it actually grew and ended up being really successful. And that ended up being, I made soap. I made and sold soap. And by the time I sold that business, there were thousands and thousands of bars curing and I made them by myself. I did it myself. I hired some people for a while. And then when I went through the whole separation divorce process, there was a big thing that happened and those people dropped off. And I just was like, okay, I'm on my own. I am by myself and I will do this. And I'm going to get out of this marriage. And that was my ticket out. If I didn't have that business, and this is really a sticking point for so many women, I think they are stuck because financially they're not able to get out. bound to that person who's really supporting them. And I think which is just another, talk about covert. It's another way of covertly keeping women in that place of oppression by telling them that they shouldn't get a job or that they're not a good Christian if they get a job or if they have a career. So,
my goodness. I mean, I think about like within our lifetime, it used to be that women couldn't get their own bank account, their own credit card, their own anything. And I don't know how they ever did anything. And couldn't do anything without their husband's permission, really, or take a job. Sometimes even employers would say, well, what does your husband think about this? Like somehow they're waiting for your husband to give his say. There's so much also about the overt and covert messages about how you're doing something wrong or you're doing something sneaky by wanting to have financial security and independence. It's incredible that you were able to run a company and a successful one that's also one that requires, it's labor intensive. So on top of running the business, there was something you needed to be creating. I don't know when you slept and if you slept and how exhausted you were over a long stretch of time.
I was exhausted. Kids wake you up at night for all kinds of different reasons. And I had a lot of them. My business was in my kitchen. So I was in the kitchen. When I was homeschooling, I would be doing things and answering questions and helping people while I was, mixing soap and pouring soap and wrapping soap. And I did get the kids involved and paid them. So sometimes they would, it was a way for them to make money as well. It was the whole thing. There was kind of are you familiar with Vision Forum, the whole Vision Forum movement?
No, what's Vision Forum?
That was another movement that happened with this guy named Doug Phillips headed it up. It was sort of Bill Gothard-ish, but not quite to that extreme. But they also taught that it was very that dominion theology.
Oh, that, yeah.
Christians are going to take over the world eventually. And so raise up, everyone have 1 million children, and we will rise up and rule the world with God's, with Christianity, basically. So try to get into, there was a big push to try to get into political positions everywhere. Raise your children to want to do that. Raise your children to want to start businesses. It was a whole thing. And that was another thing I really bought into and was heading in that direction until what really ended up being the turning point was I couldn't abide my marriage anymore. It was so painful and so confusing. And every time I would try to get help for it, I was batted down and told that it was my fault. And I think by the time you get in your 40s and you start looking, I don't know, I started looking back and realizing, something is not right here. Even as I was waking up, I was told that I was rebellious, which I had been told as a child too. If I pushed back on any ideas, I was the rebellious one. But in my 40s, when people would tell me that, I started thinking, why am I rebellious for asking questions? Why is that not okay? I started having my own back, I think. That's when I realized the link between these. It was like these families were these microcosms of the church. And the church, there's a whole milieu based on what flavor of theology that they were teaching.
Okay.
And so in my church, I went to John Piper. Are you familiar with John Piper?
I've heard, yes, but I don't know a lot of the details. I just know the name. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So he's big in Reformation circles. His favorite Christian person to model his life after was Jonathan Edwards. And Jonathan Edwards had an interesting theology too, and was also very misogynistic. But John Piper is just very misogynistic. And he was the pastor of this really big church, and he's written prolifically. He's got tons of books. He has traveled all over the world to give conferences, and he finally he retired. He was actually retired from being the pastor of the church at the time that my church excommunicated me. But it excommunicated me because of the theology that Piper taught. And even though he had left, his minions were still in place running the whole thing. I know now that so many of those leaders they were identifying with my husband. I believe that they were not, some of them had issues in their marriages. So they were identifying with my husband and putting me in the place of, their wife that they were annoyed with because she would question things and she also had a voice and wanted to share her ideas. And that was just not allowed. So I wasn't just fighting to get out of my marriage. I was fighting to be heard and fighting to change things systemically. And I realized I can't do that. It's not just an abusive home, it's an abusive church. And I walked away, and I even gave my letter of resignation of my membership 2 years before they excommunicated me, but they wouldn't give it to me because they said I was in sin because I was separated from my husband. And then when I finally, the separation and divorce process was almost 4 years long, but when my divorce was finally finalized, that's when they officially excommunicated me. But by that time, all of the people that had been in my life that were my friends and that I had built into this church and worked with and been in small groups with, they were all gone. So there was a bit of a church split because of my case.
Oh, wow.
That was a little bit gratifying, I guess. Some
Sure.
people got out, but only one person from that church has come back and said to me, I am so sorry. I was one of those people that voted to excommunicate you, and I was wrong, and I'm really sorry. Please forgive me. And that was amazing. I mean, I was bawling.
That's a lovely thing when people, come to you and acknowledge what they participated in that may have made your life harder. I mean, you can understand why they do it. It's like people who have started as new clients of mine, but start by apologizing, especially if they're former Scientologists, because it was their job to harass me. Like, remember when people followed you to your house and were in a car with darkened windows? Yeah, I was in charge of that op, they call it, which is like, really? This is a church and it has ops? But okay. Okay, let's try to get past that. But coming clean, people really thought they were doing the right thing and they thought they were doing what was best for the world and whatever else. It's very interesting. But how lovely that you got to hear that. I'm very happy for you about that. Okay, but it sounds like it was really, it shook the foundation of the place when you were leaving, when you said there was a split. How interesting.
Yeah, there were some people who actually didn't agree with what the leaders were doing and the decisions that they were making. And they just decided to end up leaving. So the church I ended up going to for a while, several people from Bethlehem were there at the other church. I don't name names in my book. The only names that I actually name are people that I know would, like, for example, Leslie Vernick. She's someone who works with women of faith in abusive marriages. And she coached me for 6 months. And so I name her because she would probably appreciate being named and given credit for the role that she played in my life. But everyone else, I've changed all of the names. I don't mention any of my kids' names. I don't mention the names of my churches, but I've talked about it elsewhere. I've talked about it online quite a bit. And I don't care if anyone knows. I just didn't want my book to be about, and then this person did this, and then this person did this. That's not what my book was about. My book, I wanted to tell my story I wanted to use humor. I wanted to use the truth. I wanted to use this therapy, IFS therapy idea to show people how healing that can be, to start viewing yourself in that way. And then I wanted to show that there's so much redemption on the other side once you get out and you start healing and you start working with people, all kinds of people out there, that people aren't scary just because they're not in your little. How I would describe it is I really thought that my church was the world. And it turned out to just be a little sandbox, a tiny little sandbox on this infinite beach. And once I got out of the sandbox, I wasn't able to see this beautiful beach that God had laid out for me with all these other people that I didn't know that had different ideas and different perspectives and different backgrounds. And it was like this big smorgasbord that I could finally feast on once I got out of that sandbox. But when you're in the sandbox, you know, whether it's a cult or a religious environment or a religious family or community, when you're in there, you feel like that's it. That is your whole world. It's like a little bubble.
Right. It's very powerful that you say that. And it's true. You don't have the advantage of having any distance from it so you can see. You don't have perspective. They talk about how sometimes in order to take a good landscape photo or video, you have to move back. You have to step out of what you're taking a picture of or a video of so you can see it all. And it is really powerful to do that finally and to see how this isn't the whole world in the slightest, although it felt that way. I think also it's interesting to hear you talk about stepping out of a relationship that was unhealthy for you. Usually that's a long time in coming. I'm just wondering what the turning point was where, especially if it was something that was sort of gradual and building, and what helped you know today's the day that I have to go or that I have to kind of start my new life.
Yeah, that's a good question. It took years for me to get to that point. A lot of thinking. It never crossed my mind that divorce was an option until towards the end. So even just that shift had to take place. First of all, I had to think, maybe it is possible that divorce could be an option. And then I had to kind of research that to figure out, you know, is there biblical precedence for getting divorced? If your partner has never been, like, my partner was faithful. He wasn't cheating on me. He was a hard worker. There were many, many good qualities about him. The abuse with him was very covert. But what ended up being the turning point for me was we'd been separated for almost 2 years for the purpose of like a therapeutic separation to hopefully get back together again. And number one, I wanted to be able to hear him say, take responsibility for all of his stuff, because he just couldn't do that. And he would minimize it, or he would mutualize it, or deny a lot of things, justify it, but he wouldn't take responsibility for it. And we had counseling. We did this really expensive, marriage intensive thing. That was kind of like my last ditch effort. That didn't work. So I gathered up all of my journals. The year before this, I had told myself, if nothing changes in the next year, I'm going to file for divorce. And I told him, I said, this is it. And I'd already kind of threatened this a little prior to this, but I told him, I'm going to give you one more year. And then nothing. He did nothing. He's just so passive. He just did nothing. And so a year later, I gathered all my journals. I kept journals. And actually, that's how I ended up writing my book, because I don't think I could have remembered half of the things that I remembered. It's just because I kept journals. But I took all my journals. I'd never reread them before. I wrote in them, and then I filed them away. When completed a book, put it in a box. So I took them all to a hotel. I rented a hotel for 2 nights, and I started reading through my journals and writing down in a document the highlights. It was the most bizarre thing. I was like, I am reading someone's story. This is somebody's story. Her name is Natalie, and nobody has helped this woman, this poor woman. See, because I was good at helping other people. I had never seen myself like that. By the time I was done, I was weeping and got on the floor of that hotel room. And I said, I'm done, God. I get it now. I'm the one that you want to rescue this woman named Natalie. And I'm going to do it. I'm going to file for divorce. And I did. The next week I went and I got an attorney and filed for divorce.
Oh, I got goosebumps. When you were talking about feeling that it was your obligation, that you were kind of sent to your husband to help him with his issues, which is never going to work, right?
Right.
In fact, a lot of people will say, I notice there are a lot of therapists, even family therapists, marriage therapists, who are divorced. They might be remarried, but they're divorced from their first person. And some of that is that they're caretakers and they're fixers, and they go to feel that it's their job to help the wounded birds of the world, right? And someone is just too wounded, or they don't want to look at their own stuff, or the things they need to fix are really not safe to be with after a while, as you noticed, I'm sure. My goodness. So, what a turning point. That is incredibly powerful. And to have a conversation with God about it. Like, listen, God, this is what's happening. And I like the way you said it, that you get to fix something and you get to cure and help and patch something together. And it's you. And that's quite beautiful.
Yeah. I heard somewhere, I don't remember where I heard this, but it really resonated with me. And I guess I teach this in my programs too in a different way, but they said, God gave you, the creator gave you one person to take care of in the world. Just one person. That's it. And that's, yes, as mothers, we take care of our children, but our children grow up. And then when they're adults, they're supposed to take care of themselves. But we were given only one person to take care of our entire life after our childhood is over. And that's ourself. And so many of us, we either don't know that, we don't understand that, or we've never been taught that. I love that the things that I've learned now, I've completely changed my parenting, by the way. So I had 9 kids. So my older kids, they got the old version of me, for most of their life. Then my younger kids are all getting this newer version of me. But I think the younger kids are happier with the newer version. And the older, it's so funny because my really older kids, they're like, how come you're not doing it how come you're not raising them like you raised us? And, because we were good kids, and these kids, they're more flamboyant. They're more expressive because they're allowed to be. It's a little messier, but it's so much healthier. It is so much healthier.
Right. I've talked to a lot of people who said, my family got a lot of points for having us as ducklings. Like, we would just walk behind our parents, all dressed the same, acting the same, not saying a word, smiling, not going to the bathroom. And from afar, it looked beautiful, very Von Trapp-y. But inside, yes, there was none of that beautiful messiness of, let me just go see what happens if I drop this off the table. Like, stuff that kids want to find out about, and they kind of need to find out about their world and themselves and what they can do and all of it. So the messiness is actually really, really important. Okay. So it's interesting, that your kids are noticing the difference in you and how you then are letting them be them.
Yes. And even the older kids too. I think we all need to know that we are loved no matter what. And I think in super fundamentalist homes, kids grow up, even though the parents love their kids and probably would say, I love my kids no matter what. There's this unspoken, like, going back to the whole covert idea, there's this covert idea of, well, I love you no matter what, but also you better obey, or you're going to get in trouble, or these bad things are going to happen to you if you don't obey. So there was no like physical abuse, but there was spanking. So I guess you could say there was, if you want to call that physical abuse, but it was just, you don't do that. You don't ask those kinds of questions. That was the home I was raised in. So I just thought, well, that's the way that it's supposed to be done. If you want to be a good parent, the interesting thing too is we raised our kids with other families from church who were doing similar things. We were all kind of in this community all together. And as I've watched some of those, my older kids have watched what's happened to those kids. Because we used to think our family's the worst of all the families, like you were saying, everyone else their ducks seemed to be all in a row. But we knew everyone knows what goes on behind their doors, right? We know that we're a mess. So our kids would be like, everyone else at our church is so good. And how come our family has all these problems? Well, we all found out later that, they all were having problems. So why not just accept that and then love each other, learn how to love each other in our messiness and allow ourselves to express who we are and be who we are and learn how to have boundaries. Okay. Boundaries are important, but also learn what forgiveness and grace looks like at the same time. It's a balance, but it's been so rewarding, I think, even for my older kids to see the difference and to think about how some of them have kids now too. And the way they're raising their kids is also very different from how I started out in my parenting. And it's very gratifying for me as a grandmother to be able, and I have so much more hope for my grandkids.
What you bring up about messiness and boundaries, because they're not mutually exclusive at all. And they're both important for growth, for everything. And I'm thinking back because it was recently from the time we're recording this together. It might not be recent from the time that people hear it, but in my home, we celebrated Passover. We had a Passover Seder. And what's interesting about that, and it's always been interesting to me, is that it is a celebration or commemoration, acknowledgement of freedom, finally getting free from being slaves for, hundreds of years. And so you would think a celebration of freedom would just be this wild party, but it's a service and you follow something, the Haggadah, you retell the same story, like there's a pattern to it, but also the word Seder means order. And so there's an order that you need to follow while you're celebrating freedom, because with freedom still comes responsibility, still comes boundaries. It still needs to be safe, but you get to enjoy something still about, your own celebration or uniqueness or individuality or whatever, but within a structure. And so I love that idea of messiness and boundaries. So now if we can go back to what you were talking about the shame and the fear, because you just touched on shame about like, how come we don't look like that family? We're not as picture perfect, let's say, whatever that means. Not that it's such a good thing to be that way, right? Because I've talked to a lot of the kids, as I'm sure you have, who grow into adults and say, oh no, that was an oppressive life. So let's move into that about shame and fear. And then I want to talk about internal family systems. And so we have so many good things to cover. So tell us about shame and fear and how, not only how that got woven in, but how you start to work on that.
I mean, shame comes from this idea that there's something fundamentally wrong with us. And I felt that for sure my whole life, that there must be something fundamentally wrong with me, that I can't always please my mom, or that I can't always be perfect, or I don't always, sometimes I make mistakes and I make wrong decisions that end up, getting me into trouble. And so what's wrong with me? What's wrong with me that I can't get a boyfriend? What's wrong with me that just all kinds of things? What's wrong with my body that my body looks this way? What's wrong with me that my kids don't always obey me, or that they don't sleep through the night, or that they, don't eat what I want them to eat, or that they complain about the food? It always came back to me. So there was a lot of shame. And then my husband, the way he was, he added to that because he had a lot of shame. And so shame just sort of begets shame. And then my children were swimming in it, and it was just horrible. I think for me, what the healing part, what's been very healing for me is, instead of looking at all these different parts of me inside, and this would get into the whole IFS, and looking at them and being critical of them. I mean, I grew up with so much criticism. Everywhere I turned, there was criticism. So I criticized myself. It was very easy for me to just criticize myself. So when I learned about IFS, I learned that we need to, instead of criticize and fight against ourselves, we actually need to move towards ourselves with compassion and be good listeners and understand why different parts of us think the way they think and care about them. Just like I think in the real world, what's been healing for me is getting to know people who aren't afraid to move toward me when I am dysregulated, or when I need help, or when I'm not perfect. When I rant and rave on the phone I have an older daughter who's, one of my best friends. When I rant and rave to her, she doesn't just go, oh, I can't do this and hang up the phone. She moves towards me and asks me questions and loves me and accepts this about me. Not that I do that to her all the time, but I'm just saying I'm not afraid. I don't have to live in shame or run away from people because I've got some people in my I'm remarried. I have a husband who will move toward me. So how can we move towards ourselves? How can we move towards those parts of us? Like there's a part of me that's very rude and kind of angry about stuff. If you grow up in a home where anger is an emotion that's looked down on and you don't get angry, or it's okay for my mom to get angry, but it's not okay for you to get angry, which is so bizarre, but I truly believe that. It's okay for mom. Mom has good reasons to get angry. I don't have good reasons to get angry. So if I get angry, it's because I'm rebellious or there's something fundamentally wrong with me. But what if I could move towards that part of me that's angry and go, why are you angry? Let's look at this. What are you believing that's causing you to be angry? Maybe you have good reasons to be angry. Maybe your anger is actually an emotion that's going to be a force to help you get out of this or to set a boundary, to show you, I don't have a boundary in this area. Maybe I need to set a boundary with these people here that keep taking advantage of me. Maybe that's why I'm angry. But you never find that out if you're just like, I'm angry, bad. You shouldn't be angry. You must be doing something wrong. Maybe I'm not doing enough for these people. Maybe I need to do more for these people. And pretty soon we're, doing all the things and just making ourselves even more oppressed. Or actually have these parts of me talk in the book and tell the story from their perspective. But I've got a part of me that's very dramatic and thinks that everything, it's either everything is this or it's everything is this. And there's no like gray nuance in between. Very black and white thinker. And in order to get that part inside of me to calm down and actually to start opening itself up to seeing that there's so much nuance, things aren't always all this or all that. I had to move towards that part of me and get curious and interested in why that part of me was like that. Where did that come from? What happened in my life, or what set of circumstances or what patterns were in my life that taught me that everything was either black or white? And do I want to continue to believe that? Or do I want to change my thinking on that? And that's deprogramming right there. That's taking what you were programmed with as a child, and everyone was programmed. Everybody. That you don't have to be in a cult to be programmed. Everyone was programmed as a child to believe whatever they grew up in. But when we're adults, one of our responsibilities is to look at those beliefs one by one and to decide, is this a belief I want to carry into my future? Or is this a belief I want to tweak a little bit? Or is it a belief that I just want to let be part of my past?
Oh, I love that. Yeah, that you can develop a dialogue with it. It doesn't become you, it becomes this part, and that you can look at it and wonder if it's something that you need, that you want. I love that. I think so much of what you're talking about too is trying things on for size. If you haven't had a chance to be able to have your emotions, to have your reactions, I could imagine just kind of raising your voice, as uncomfortable as that is, but just first of all, to know you can, to see what it feels like, to see how loud you get and how loud you can get. And, a lot of that is trial and error. But I'm sure also, as you're saying, there's like this pendulum swing. And then I think over time, you kind of find somewhere in the middle that fits. But I think the pendulum swing is really important when people have had these very structured, very dominant kind of external forces around them. I've sometimes heard them yell, and I've said while they're yelling, "What are you yelling about?" And they're like, "I don't know, but it feels really good." And so they're just like, "Great, keep going until you don't maybe need to do that anymore," because then you don't want to still be reacting, right, to your earlier years. You want to just be acting kind of in your life in a way that feels in concert with you. But I like that you can be you and fine tune it as you go, but based on you, not someone else's decision about how you're supposed to behave.
Right. And I think too, accepting also that when you're going through this process, and I think it's a process we'll go through the rest of our lives, we'll always be tweaking things. But as you go, it's going to be messy sometimes, and you're going to make mistakes, and you're going to bump up against other people and their feelings. When you have the belief, which I do now, that instead of thinking there's something fundamentally wrong with me, I just think I'm a human being. And so I'm going to make mistakes. There are circumstances in my life are going to happen where I might feel discombobulated on some days. I might react to something, or I might overreact to something in a way that I later on reflect back on, or someone might give me feedback on that. And then I will realize, I regret that. But where we tend to have a hard time taking responsibility is when we feel that shame and we think that I shouldn't be that way. Whereas if we think, I made a mistake. Sometimes I make mistakes. Sometimes I do those things and I am so sorry. I see how that impacted your life and I take responsibility for my part in that. And I will do better next time. And I love you and I want to be sensitive to where you're coming from. That's how we build good relationships with other people too, by taking responsibility. But I think it's very difficult to take personal responsibility if we have a lot of shame or if we have this belief that we have to be perfect, because then we're going to always be fighting to defend ourselves that, no, I'm pretty sure I did my best and I was pretty perfect there. And you must have done something to screw it all up, right? I see that everywhere, that pattern everywhere I look, in my own life, in my kids' lives. And that we have I finally put a thing on the wall that said, it's okay to make mistakes, but it's not okay to not take responsibility for those mistakes. I want them to own their behaviors, because then they'll also, when we can offer that to ourselves, then we can offer that to other people too, so that they can feel comfortable to make mistakes. My kids, they can say, I just read this recently. Oh, I think it was in a spiritual abuse assessment sheet. And it said, were you ever able to, or no, maybe it wasn't that, but the question was, were you able to say, I hate you to your parents and still know that you were completely loved? And I'm like, oh my gosh, if I said I hate you to my parents, my head would roll. I mean, I don't know I have no idea what would have happened to me if I'd ever said that. But I've heard that a couple of times from kids. I hate you. So, but I can take that. Yes, it hurts and it's hard as a parent to hear that. But also I know that came out of their issues, whatever's triggering them at that moment. And I can move toward them. And instead of like, okay, now I guess I have to give you the silent treatment for 2 weeks because I guess you hate me. Now it can be, they don't hate me. They probably right now are hating themselves. And they're saying that to me because they don't know how to handle that, because their brains aren't fully developed and they're feeling all these big feelings and they don't know what to do with what's going on in their lives. When we offer ourselves that compassion and that empathy, that's when we are then able to offer that to other people as well. But it starts inside of ourselves. I feel like in the Christian world, we're taught so much that we have to help other people be good Christians and serve them and do all the things for them and help them heal. But our healing and our love has to spring, first of all, within ourselves. And then it just spills up and over. And it's just, then the love is not forced. It's natural. It's full of grace. It's full of beauty. It's okay if it's messy. It's more organic. It's not fake. It's not based on rules. It's based on wisdom and movement towards each other.
Oh, that was quite beautiful. I think also, with this idea of kids saying, I hate you. I don't think I could have said that growing up, but for two different reasons. I mean, for my mom, I would have been punished. For my dad, he would have started crying. He's very sensitive.
Oh, yeah.
And I couldn't.
My dad wouldn't have hurt a flea. I never heard him raise his voice, and my mom was very verbally abusive to him, and he just sat there and took it. So yeah, no, I would never said that to my dad either, probably for the same reason.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, oh no. Okay, I'm sorry. No, sorry. It's okay. Here's a tissue. Okay. Um, but I remember being a school counselor for a period of time, and there was this kid who was very angry, and he was telling everyone he hates them. And so the parents came in to meet with him in my office, and he walked in and he said, "And I hate you." He says to his mom, "I hate you." He says to his dad, and he turns to me and he said, "And I hate you." And they were about to be punitive towards him. That's it. When we get home, there was this like impending threat. So I said to him, "Hold on a sec." I said to all of them, "Hold on a sec. Everyone sit down." The problem with that is that it's not specific enough. And I don't know why that occurred to me, but it's true. Like, what does that mean? Why? Why are you upset? What do you want me to learn from how you're feeling? Are you testing to see if we'll still like you if you say this? Are you not feeling safe in your world? Like, let's talk about it so we understand. Because how can we change and help if it's just that I hate you? Because it really is not at all clear. So let's get clear about it. And then I thought, well, that might be a way to respond. Like, I want to know what's on their mind. That doesn't really help.
I love that. Yeah. And our reaction is, I understand the parents' reaction. It's like we get defensive for ourselves because it hurts to hear those things. But those things there's something deeper there. And to be able to move toward that with curiosity, I wonder what's going on for him when we are good inside of ourselves and know that and are settled within ourselves. I think then we have more resiliency to be able to not take things personally. Not that we wouldn't have boundaries. And I want to be careful what I say, because we're talking about a parent with children, but when we're with other people, other adults, that would be different. That would be, now there needs to be boundaries around, why are you verbally throwing up on me? And I need to protect myself from that if it becomes a pattern, for example.
Right. Right. Exactly. Going back to also something I'd love you to talk about in relation to this. When you are talking about your kids taking responsibility for things, apologizing, affirming that they've done something and that they can say that to another person, I wonder what's been like for you to have this realization of how important it is and how empowered it is and how confident it is, because here you were raised with not hearing it, I'm sure. And pastors don't tend to say it in some, not always, but in some of these churches that we talk about on the show, that people grow up never hearing, "I'm sorry." And that you wonder about the adults in your life and why they never felt like they could say it. Because I think for a lot of them, it would feel like an admission, but also weakness or something, but it's not at all that.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I do see that. I feel like that's almost a prevalent thing in the world, actually, to have a difficult time saying sorry and owning behavior. But on the other hand, like Bill Gothard would teach, you should always own your behavior and say you're sorry. But it was weird because it was only taught for certain people. Like, I don't remember him ever telling parents that they should say they're sorry to their children, or that they should be working on that on a regular basis with their children. I don't remember that ever being taught. And I really think because underlying that whole system of thinking is, how do we manipulate and control certain people? How do we manipulate and control women? How do we manipulate and control children? And it's a very patriarchal, way of thinking. And he believed that was biblical, which I no longer believe that. But yeah, I think it's just in culture, though, in general, people don't want to take responsibility. But again, I think it's because of the fear and the shame. It's because people are largely unhealed. And I love that even just 20 years later, there's so much therapy is a thing now. There's not a stigma to it as much as it used to be 20 years ago. It wasn't even really available all that much 20 years ago, I feel like. Now you can get it online. Self-development, people are viewing that now as a very important thing. I'm hopeful that that's something that will eventually slowly shift the world and how we think about ourselves, so that we don't have quite so much shame, so that we can take responsibility without having it crush us. And I just think our relationships will be so much healthier and better if we do.
Right. Oh, I absolutely agree. And I think I'm curious also just in terms of internal family systems, when you were able to learn about it, it's not something that is going to be familiar to a lot of people listening. So I know that you've already talked about it a bit, but if you can kind of describe what it is and how it gives a structure or a filter really through which to see things. What is it about?
So internal family systems, you might see IFS is the little shortened version of it. It's a way of looking at ourselves that recognizes we each have different parts of us. And those parts have their own beliefs or programming based on how we were raised in our life experiences. So some parts are called manager parts, and they try to prevent pain by working hard to manage the circumstances and the people in our lives. And they might do this by trying to please people or control people or manage other people's emotions or judge people and so on. And those manager parts of us might think, for example, that if only we could make people like us and do what we want them to do, then we would be happy and we would avoid pain. That's just an example of a belief that a manager part might have. Then these other parts of us are called firefighter parts. And those parts spring into action if our manager parts are unsuccessful at preventing the pain. So the firefighter parts, they try to put out the fire of our pain. They want to make the pain go away. And they might do this. They have all kinds of ways of doing this: overeating, over drinking, overspending, self-harming, using drugs. These parts of us believe that immediate relief is the answer and that we need to do whatever it takes to make the pain go away. The only problem is some of the methods that we use to get immediate relief often lead to long-term damage. When I was trying to explain this to my kids, and I told them to imagine imagine a school bus with the firefighter parts on one side of the school bus and the manager parts on the other side of the school bus. And then way in the back of the bus are these little exiles. And they're just the younger parts of us that absorbed past trauma. It could be big T trauma or small T trauma, but we could have acquired exiles from getting bullied in school or losing a friend in an accident or growing up with overly strict parents or whatever. We have lots of exiles, but they're in the back of the bus. And then the front of our bus is us, and we're in the driver's seat. The only problem is that these parts of us, they tend to want to come up to the front of the bus and take over the steering wheel, or they might have a food fight. And they're arguing with each other and they're judging each other. And some of them are in alliances with each other and other parts are, fighting against them. So the name of my book is All the Scary Little Gods. And that name sort of encapsulates a lot of different things. It could be the scary little gods of, like the leaders, the religious leaders that were in my life. Basically, scary little gods, just anything that I worshiped or fawned after to try to make it through life and survive through life. But, some of my parts, I thought of them as scary little gods too. They were kind of running my life in a lot of ways too. Because of these, they all had their own beliefs about things. And I didn't know how to change those beliefs, or I didn't understand that the only way that they could settle down is if I would really listen to them and what slowed everything down when something would happen to me, and listen to what that part of me was saying so that I could ask some questions and be curious about that part and move toward that part. So there's a theme throughout my whole book about an empathetic witness, and a quote at the very beginning of the book that kind of it's really what the whole book is about. And it's Peter A. Levine in an unspoken voice. And he just said, trauma is not what happens to us, but what we hold inside in the absence of an empathetic witness. And so I just feel like IFS is a way of being an empathetic witness to ourselves. And I think that's why it's so healing, because those parts of us have not been listened to. They've not been heard. And that's one of the reasons why they're largely unhealed, because nobody is witnessing them. Nobody cares about them. And I feel like it's our job to learn about them and to move toward them and love them and be that empathetic witness to their pain. I have a little picture. I have two little pictures of myself on my computer here of me. One is when I'm about 1 year old, and one I'm probably 7 or 8 years old. And I keep those pictures right there on my computer because I want to be an empathetic witness to my younger self because she didn't have one. And so whenever I start thinking, whenever I start getting critical of myself and I can hear that critical self-talk start happening, I look at those pictures and I say, would you say that to that little girl? What you just said to yourself right now, would you say that to her? No way. But you're saying that to yourself. So what would you say to that little girl if she was struggling with the same things that you are? And the fact is that little girl lives inside of me still. And so as I take care of her, and that's actually why I ended up letting her write the first part of my book. I said, you know what, little Natalie, I'm going to actually let you write. I'm going to let your voice tell your story the way you want to tell it. And then after each little chapter, my book is made up of 89 chapters, but they're short. They're just little kind of power-packed little chapters. But at the end of each chapter in the first section, there's this voice that comes in. So little Natalie shares her little story, and then there's a little paragraph, and it's the voice of maybe God or adult Natalie. You could make it whatever you want. It's basically just the voice of the empathetic witness. And it's what I would say to that child if I literally sat there, and when I wrote a little section, I would think, okay, what would I say to her right now? She just told me this precious story. What would I want to say? What would love say to this little girl? And then I wrote that little paragraph. So at the end of each chapter in the first section, there's these little love letters to little Natalie. And I think a lot of people who've read my book they've said that that's been really healing for them because it models for them how they can take care of their little me that lives inside of them. And that's my hope. I hope that people will find themselves and fall in love with themselves and make a commitment to taking care of themselves moving forward.
That is so beautiful, so powerful. Thank you, thank you, thank you for the conversation today. And my goodness, it's such a good reminder about how to treat yourself gently, respectfully, in a healing way, with grace, with a lot of patience, being the parent you didn't have, being the person you needed. That is so beautiful. Thank you so much for that, Natalie. And let the listeners know also about your books, where to find them, and where to find other things that you're doing out there where they can hear you.
Well, all of my work is on my public website, flyingfreenow.com. I have a podcast called Flying Free. So people who are listening to this podcast are probably people who like podcasts. So if you just go onto your little podcast app and search for Flying Free with Natalie Hoffman, you can follow my podcast. It's geared towards Christian women of faith, really, because I have helped women in other faiths as well, but who are experiencing emotional or spiritual abuse in their relationship or in their religious community. And my books are on Amazon. All the Scary Little Gods is on Amazon, and Is It Me? Making Sense of Your Confusing Marriage also on Amazon.
Really wonderful. Thank you for your time today. And I know this is going to be a very moving and wonderful thing for people to hear. And so I appreciate the way you think about things and the way you express them, and just also being very open about your own challenges and your journey and your successes along the way, just from taking some time to think about how you want your life and the life of your children to be different. So that's really wonderful.
Thank you so much for having me.
One more thing before you go. Thank you very much to Natalie It is always incredible when you hear about these women and talk to these women who have rebuilt their lives in these really significant ways. It was a great conversation about paths to healing and internal family systems and messiness and boundaries and shame and fear. So many good subjects, so many important subjects. There is something that is not easy for a lot of people to do, especially people who were raised in very strict environments, repressed environments, abusive environments, controlled environments, where it is almost unheard of at times and rarely thought about to be kind to yourself, to give yourself permission to make a mistake, to give yourself an allowance to rest, to take good care of yourself, to listen to what your body is telling you it needs, to follow what your mind is telling you, and to give yourself also forgiveness for not being perfect, however that was defined by the person or the group controlling you. There are a lot of times that people will be made to feel that if they offer grace to themselves, if they're kind and permissive about their own humanity, that they will then become lazy. They will not be pushing themselves to live a life of dutiful service, of going without to show that they're holy, of suffering to show that they are of pure heart. And what gets lost in that is kindness, is softness, is the ability to kind of look at yourself in the mirror with a certain amount of love and a certain amount of gentleness. What also gets lost in that is the fact that when people are raised in ways where they don't really get to be children, and the child inside of them is still there, wanting to be able to branch out, push the walls out, have some fun, do something spontaneous, make mistakes, and have it be okay because it's all part of growing and learning. And that child also wants to be heard and understood and treated in a developmentally appropriate way, which also does not happen in these groups. Children are treated like mini adults. So if you make a mistake, if you forget something, if you yawn, if you get antsy and need to move around, all those things are seen as bad rather than age appropriate. So here, as you go into adulthood, you have this child within. And this child within needs some love, needs to be treated kindly, needs to be given permission to be, and needs to be able to be held and cared for. And if the grown-ups in your life are not the ones who can turn around and take care of you in that way and help heal some of these very deep wounds that are carried around inside that child within you, then you sometimes need to turn to yourself for that kind of love and acceptance and softness and permission and unconditional acceptance. And if you also are having trouble giving it to yourself, you want to surround yourself with people who will care for all of you, including that child within, who will not make you feel bad for just wanting to do something that is fun, that has sort of no spiritual significance, that isn't about taking care of a task, where you just may want to laugh and you just might want to be silly and you just might want to play a game and you just might want to roll around on the grass. You just might want to do the things you couldn't do before. It is possible to do a lot of healing when you care for yourself and you care for that part of you, that younger part of you that you've carried into your adult life that really is still there. And depending on your childhood, might be wounded and might be very unsure and might be jumpy and might be mistrustful and might be traumatized. It's good for you to also get support if you find that you feel there is this wounded part of you inside. Many therapists know how to address that. And so I would hope that you could reach out for that kind of support and help. And then you could also benefit from surrounding yourself with people who are not going to make you feel silly or stupid for wanting to be silly. There is a playfulness that people don't get to experience when raised in these environments, where life really is about suffering through, enduring. And then that's how your adult life is too. And in these marriages, like the ones that Natalie talks about, that are abusive and confusing, that are serious, that can make you feel caged, where you can't do what you want to do and you can't be random and you can't be spontaneous. And you can very often not be joyful. So when do you get to have fun? When do you get to have joy? You have to create that allowance in your life. And you do it, of course, as I mentioned, by surrounding yourself with people who will support that part of you and will still be able to see the mature and wonderful and bright adult that still exists there while you're having fun, while you're giggling, while you're playing a game. But most important, you want to be able to allow yourself to accept that part of you and not put it down. There are these things that I've talked about on the podcast called negative introjects. These are ideas that you have brought into your psyche, into your mind, that have been given from another source. Meaning, if you have been surrounded by people who have put down the fact that you needed to go rest, and that was considered lazy, or have put down if you wanted to do something that wasn't about studying the Bible, that maybe you wanted to do something in the arts, or you wanted to do something else, or you just didn't want to get married, or you weren't ready to have children, whatever it is, where it goes against the construct of the group. And they tell you you're bad for thinking that and for wanting that. And you then absorb that message and think of yourself as bad for wanting those things and being those things. Be careful when you find yourself talking to yourself with these negative introjects, because while you have left potentially an organization, it hasn't left you. If you're carrying around the words, the messages, the damning kinds of diagnoses about you. So think about how you have learned to talk to yourself. Think about the ways you've learned to see the child inside of you and see if you can turn it around and have it be one that is happy, that is accepting, that is praiseworthy, and that is loving. That's what you deserve. And that's what the child within has always deserved. Take good care. Talk to you next week.
Thank you very much for listening. Please support IndoctriNation on Patreon at patreon.com/indoctrination. Be sure to give us a follow on our social media. Find us on Facebook and Instagram using @IndoctrinationPodcast And for Twitter, find us at @_indoctrination. We love hearing from you too. So send us an email at indoctrinationshow@gmail.com. And for more updates on the show, visit our website at www.podpage.com/indoctrination.